have to comment before I start about Gary's proposal. I sometimes mention in this context that my mother and sister teach 3- and 4-year-olds. And when my mother founded her nursery school in the 1960s, she made cooking a kind of centerpiece. And so they've always used cooking to teach math. But I need to tell them, think about chemistry. Anyway, in terms of my seminar proposal, as Jim mentioned, it is kind of what I'm proposing evolves out of a seminar that I offered last summer for the New Haven teachers. And that seminar was a response to a request from teachers for a seminar that had something to do with the topic of identity. So I'm thinking of the seminar for the National Initiative next summer as really evolving out of that, but it's such an enormous topic and range of opportunities and facets and possible questions to pursue that, of course, it's open to adaptation and focusing dependent on fellows' particular interests. So the kind of key word in the title I proposed, literature, life writing, and identity for next summer, the key word, kind of the starting place and the core to go back to, is this mysterious but compelling term of identity. And that's, we really found last summer in talking in our seminar meetings and in the development of curriculum units, that was an idea and a need that was really so urgent for, and so open and difficult for school age young people, all the way from the earliest school years through the end of high school. So it bears addressing in a lot of ways. When we think about the term identity, we can think of a phrase like identity politics and quickly think of a number of kinds of categories by which we all identify ourselves, whether race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality or able-bodiedness or disability or geographical region and so on. And those kinds of categories of identity are obviously shaping and rich and challenging and important, and we did talk a lot about them last summer, and we found that our discussions naturally moved fluidly and often really suggestively and productively between talking about the texts, literary texts we had read and how they treated identity, and talking about issues in our classrooms and issues for our individual students and even for ourselves. So it moves back and forth among those levels, and that's certainly a part of what we addressed and what I would want to think about in our seminar next summer. For instance, we improvised a new one-week unit on transgender identity in the course of the summer because that was so much in the news and so pressing, and indeed something that was important for some of the students that teachers were working with. At the same time, we really tried to explore ways that notions of identity are much more individual and difficult to pin down and evolving and dynamic than strictly filling out a kind of grid of checkboxes about these different categories of identity would suggest. And that's a place that what you might call storytelling, whether fictional or non-fictional, comes in as a great resource. We used as a kind of touch point for thinking about this more open-ended kind of basis of identity, Erik Erikson's classic formulation about crises of identity and his formulation of the way inner and outer views of identity are constantly interacting and being negotiated in a dynamic way. So we talked about all of this specifically in relation to literature last summer as quite broadly defined, sampling literary works in a great range of genres, from picture books to memoirs to poems to short stories to novels, including Mary Shelley's early 19th century novel Frankenstein, to memoirs, and trying to think about the kind of resources that literary works give individuals, both as readers and as writers, for addressing the demands of identity. And I was just looking at this, this description that I've developed of our possible seminar for next year, and I see in the center of it a formulation that I came up with that I think expresses something of the kind of hope that we all attach to this interplay between literature and identity, and that is when I refer to how literature can offer models of the power of storytelling to make sense of individual lives and to find meaning in them, even in suffering, conflict, or confusion. And I think you all know that on the ground as individuals and also as teachers, the way storytelling can serve as a resource for people navigating their ways through very difficult and uncertain lives. But I'd like to adapt the approach that we took last year to bring this third term into the explicit formulation of the title or of our conception of the topic and put life writing in there as well. And this is a term that literary scholars use. It's a very baggy term to refer to the great range of kinds of writing in which people express and explore their own individual life experience and stories, whether in personal letters or private journal entries or memoirs, or as it happens now in our own time, say graphic memoirs or autobiographical poems. But this term life writing overlaps with the term of literature. A number of the things we read under the rubric of literature can also be called life writing, including, say, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, or one of our local authors here, Dwayne Bett's memoir about coming of age in prison. He's a recent graduate of the Yale Law School, an author in prose and nonfiction writing, but also in poetry. And so I'd like to bring to the fore those forms that have a relatively straightforward relation to the individual author's life, but I say relatively straightforward, always complex and creative. And I think it would be quite interesting to play that term off of the term literature, where there are opportunities for imaginative expressions of identity that do not map directly onto the facts of an individual's life story. I mentioned Dwayne Betts. We had an opportunity to meet with him last summer, which was really exciting, and we had read both, just to illustrate the relation between these two abstract terms, first two terms, literature and life writing, in my proposed seminar's title. He's the author of a memoir and also of poems that are often seem to be about a protagonist, maybe even a first-person protagonist, who is not exactly himself. And Dwayne Betts talked about how reviewers, supposedly sophisticated reviewers, often assumed that every speaker in his poems was himself, and that he had done all the things and thought all the things and committed all the crimes and whatever, experienced all the things that characters in his poems had experienced. And it was so interesting to talk to him, who has had already at a young age a life full of experience as an individual that is hard to come to terms with and that we might want to see voiced, about how important it was for him to write in other voices and about other people's lives, and that was a way too for him to have a really rich sense of identity. So I think this overlaps a little bit with some of the things Jessica was talking about, the interest in her seminar proposal, really exploring that border between fiction and nonfiction and what's possible in each, and the way imagination comes into that in the context of this seminar, specifically in terms of the development of a sense of identity that is full of possibility and encompasses other people's experience as well. I hope that this proposed way of adapting and recasting the seminar that I led last summer gives room for social studies teachers, history teachers, to enter into this discussion and develop units that might focus on various kinds of life writing that might be used as primary documents in looking into social history, for instance, and or writing teachers thinking about working with young people in ways to write about their own lives, imagine other lives, and so on. Thank you.